Good evening. Good to be here tonight. And I love that song. I love the sentiment of that song. Andrea and I were halfway around the world about 3 years ago on a little island nation called Seychelles, doing some gospel work there. And we were studying with a really tall guy who plays professional basketball in France. It was the off season. He was home. He grew up in a Muslim family. And we studied this Ecclesiastes thing that I went over with you last night. And he was all ready to get to the next part. And I said, okay, next time we're gonna get together and we're gonna talk about Jesus. And he said, you mean he has something to do with this? It had never occurred to him that Jesus had anything to do with this. But really, Jesus has everything to do with this. As I told you last night, I preach in the Silicon Valley, and we've got an international congregation. I tell people I preach in the United Nations. We've got a little bit of everything from everywhere. We've got South Americans and North Americans. We've got blacks and whites, Hispanics, East Asians, Indians, and Europeans. We've got people who are multi-ethnic, multilingual, and it's just an interesting hodgepodge, but the larger culture there is reflective of that. And so we're currently doing a Sunday morning class on world religions. And we've talked about Islam motivating people through fear and greed as opposed to love and grace. Different kind of God, different kind of system. We've talked about Hinduism and Buddhism. And one thing that these other faith systems don't have is they don't have a rationale that is logical, that would lead people through evidence to believe in their system. There's a big, huge blank. And they also don't have something that I think is our secret weapon. There's a big blind spot in their systems that we have and they don't have. And that secret is Jesus Christ of Nazareth. We've got him, they don't. And the difference is profound. It's huge, and I think it's a good exercise to just go through what these faith systems promote, what they believe, what the adherents believe. Because you take Jesus out of the recipe, and the sin problem is not dealt with. There's no atonement. And so you've got to come up with something else that would motivate people somehow. And that something else invariably is inferior. It's an inferior motivational system. It's inferior in every respect because they don't have Jesus. And I want to begin exploring some paragraphs in the Gospel of Luke that will introduce it to us through the remainder of the weekend. A number of things that Jesus said, a number of things that he taught, a number of things that he did that were so extraordinary that these are faith builders. That's how I look upon them. And I'm going to explain that a little bit in more detail on Saturday morning into Sunday, what exactly I mean by that and how we could take paragraphs from the Gospel of Luke and build conviction, build trust, build surrender. We'll break that down and look at the rationale of all that. But given the fact that our American culture is taking decisive steps farther away from the Judeo-Christian ethic on which this country was built and away from biblical literacy that was once taken for granted, that can no longer be taken for granted, giant steps toward atheism and agnosticism, away from any kind of belief in Jesus Christ, invariably it's important to set the stage. And if you're going to go through Luke or portions of Luke, which I like to do in my teaching of lost souls. I like to go through a kind of a Luke Acts reading program, and I'm selective. I don't necessarily read every verse of every chapter. I urge people to do that on their own. But I choose paragraphs that are designed to help them build their conviction, build their trust, build their sense of surrender. And then we talk about, dotting those I's and crossing the T's and so on. But from the outset, we've got to talk about who Jesus was and why he's central to everything that we believe or ought to believe. Who was he anyway? We've got 4 books in our Bibles that are devoted to filling in that part of the jigsaw puzzle I talked about last night. The picture of who Jesus is. Biblical accounts of the life of Christ. And Luke is fascinating because Luke writes a 2-part work. Acts is the sequel, and there are many things that are anticipated in Luke that are more fully developed in Acts. And after doing this for many, many years, I see connections between Luke and Acts that I never saw before. And it's very helpful when you're studying Acts to be able to come back to Luke. Say, remember when we studied X, Y, or Z? Here, or A, B, and C, and here's the X, Y, and Z to that. And Luke was a medical doctor, the beloved physician, Colossians 4:14, Paul alludes to there. He was a companion of the Apostle Paul. And the Gospel of Luke, again, is the first volume of a 2-part work, of which Acts is the sequel. And the whole thing is introduced with these words in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you might have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. I don't know the specific culture here very well, but I know that I deal with a lot of people who don't have a clue about the Bible. And I believe that's becoming more and more true of all of American society. And so we need to reintroduce people to Jesus. And we need to reintroduce people to the evidence for Jesus. I think that is critically important. In fact, I would even say that we need to reintroduce our kids. Or maybe introduce to them for the very first time the foundational premise on which our faith is built, and why we believe that this isn't just a bunch of myths, legends, fairy tales, or as one very prominent atheist author wrote a few years ago, a bunch of stories on par with Jack and the Beanstalk. I don't believe that for a minute, but why is it that I don't believe that this is Jack and the Beanstalk? Many critics have assumed that you take a scientific view of things that automatically rules out religious faith, and somehow people that have a religious impulse are intellectual lightweights and inferior, and that absolutely is not the case. In fact, when I was doing some research on cholesterol, which has been a lifelong issue for me personally, Dean Ornish a few years ago said some things about science and faith, very prominent researcher with heart issues. He said modern medicine is based on science, and scientists tend to believe only what can be measured and observed, even though what can be quantified may not be what is most important. Like the man who looks under the street lamp for his wallet because the light is better there, even though he lost it over in the dark alley. We may be looking in the wrong place if we can study only what can be measured. He goes on to say, while it's true that seeing is believing, it's equally true that believing is seeing. If you believe that you're hungry when you drive into a new city, you'll see the restaurants, but you may not be aware of the hardware stores, even if you drive right by one. We see what we believe, and our preconceptions influence our perceptions. That is absolutely right. I've found that to be true. People have preconceptions about things, and they see only what they want to see. And sometimes don't even see truth that is staring them in the face. They look right past it because it's not on their personal filter. It's not on their radar screen, even though it's staring right at them. Once in a while, I'll ask my wife, where is the, and you fill in the blank, and I'm looking right at it and I don't see it. Honey, it's right in front of you. And that's what a lot of skeptics do. Truth is staring right at them, and they don't see it for what it is. And so, are the Gospels full of legends and folklore? Many skeptics presume to redefine the purpose of the four Gospels in such a way as to attack their integrity. One standard line among unbelievers is to say that early Christians exaggerated in reporting what Jesus did. And the Gospels were more theological than historical. In fact, one group of revisionist historians, the Jesus Seminar, prominent in the 1990s, dismissed a great deal of what Jesus said and did. They said that he did not say 82% of what the Gospels attribute to what Jesus said, and he did not do 86% of what the Gospels say that he did. And in order to get there, this group of anti-supernatural, largely unbelieving scholars, New Testament scholars, if you want to call them that, they had an agenda to malign the Gospels. And when they came to Luke, one thing that's said in the Acts of Jesus, which is a document or a book that was produced by that particular organization, they say he was not an academic historian attempting to achieve an historically accurate picture. That's a quote. In their view, the Gospels are folklore that cannot be trusted. Now, I think we have to deal with that from time to time. I think we have to help our kids do that, because if we don't, they're going to walk into a university classroom somewhere, and a professor is going to blast them. And he'll see as his mission in life to try to purge them of this ridiculous religious nonsense. And if they're unprepared to deal with that, then shame on us. We need to give them tools to be aware of that and to be able to give answer for their faith. But here's the thing. We don't have to rely on what someone else says about why Luke wrote. We can read Luke's own words about why he wrote. And he tells us himself in his own words. The introduction you've just read with me, Luke 1:1-4, establishes 4 basic points. And here they are. Number 1, that he's writing about the things of Jesus' life that were so momentous, even when eyewitnesses were still around, that he speaks of the things that have been accomplished or fulfilled among us. That's not ordinary happenstance events. They were witnessing history, and they knew it. They were witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy, and they knew it. These were things that were accomplished, things that were fulfilled, things that were magnificent, and they were trying to put their minds around it and even grasp the significance of it, but they knew it was great, far beyond what can be quantified. Secondly, he says, eyewitnesses have handed them down directly to us. We didn't get it third hand, fourth hand. We've got it directly from eyewitnesses. Luke himself was not an eyewitness, although he was an eyewitness to things that happened in some of the events of Acts, because he was a companion of Paul. But he was not a direct eyewitness to Jesus, but he was in contact with all kinds of people who were. Thirdly, he says that the things that happened here did not remain word of mouth. Many have already compiled or undertaken to compile a narrative of those things that have been accomplished. And his unequivocal aim, in no uncertain terms, is that you, Theophilus, the reader, might know the exact truth or have certainty about the things that you have been taught. There are a lot of faulty presuppositions of skeptics. And most of the people that I've gone through this material with at least will give Luke a chance. But once in a while you have people with honest questions about this. And so we've got to deal with this. And here's what I tell them. Skeptics of this material often enter the investigation with the deck stacked against anything that Luke says from the get-go. They have a foundational premise that this cannot possibly be true. And so they assume that Jesus is not the Son of God. They assume that he could not possibly have performed the miracles that Luke attributes to him. Why? Because those things don't happen in the real world. But if there is a God, and if there is a Son of God who came to live among us, you would expect him to do precisely the very things that Jesus did, as credentials that he was not an ordinary human being, but in fact that he came from a supernatural source or origin. And so I say to those that have an axe to grind, an anti-supernatural axe to grind, you err not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. As Jesus said to the Sadducees in the Gospel of Matthew 22:29. It's a revisionist history with an anti-supernatural bias. And here's what I tell people. If you take the evidence and you throw it out of court before the trial occurs, before the case is even heard, the verdict that the jury is going to come up with is going to be skewed. You've got to take the evidence as it stands, weigh it carefully, weigh it honestly. If it has shortcomings, then so be it. But at least weigh the evidence that we've got here. And don't enter into this with an anti-supernatural bias, because there's a powerful God behind all of this, and you would expect Jesus to do extraordinary things if indeed he was who he claimed to be. And so to this end, Luke cross-checks his sources, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, he says. He did the kind of research a historian does. Like a good detective, he collects first-hand information in order to reconstruct exactly what happens. And incidentally, how do fairy tales begin? What's the formula? Once upon a time. But that's not what you read in Luke. You read things such as chapter 3, verse 1. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. That's not the formula that you read when you read a fairy tale. Once upon a time. And incidentally, all of these people that Luke mentions here are known from other sources, Josephus and other sources, in the first century, to have really existed, including specific titles and place names and so on. And so this is not just pulled out of thin air here. Now, Luke's aim is to represent what really happened, and he's only one step removed from eyewitnesses, and he's collecting this information from eyewitnesses. He's in contact with eyewitnesses, and as Paul says in Acts 26:26, reacting to Festus' statement that your great learning has driven you mad, he said, I'm not mad. I'm not a raving lunatic. This has not been done in a corner. It's not some back alley operation. This is open. It's above board. It's above the table so everyone can see it, investigate it, look at the evidence honestly. The Jesus Seminars, Acts of Jesus, says the foundation of the critical approach to the Gospels is the recognition that much of the information in the Gospels is based on hearsay. And I just have to say, don't believe everything that they say about Luke as well as Matthew, Mark, and John. Who is in a better position to state the author's intentions, the author himself or someone 2,000 years later that reinterprets his intentions? Who was in a better position to know what really happened? A first century doctor who was right there in contact with multiple eyewitnesses, or a 21st century skeptic? Who has a higher ethical code? A Christian 2,000 years ago who wants to tell us exactly what happened, or a revisionist historian with an anti-supernatural bias? If someone should assert that Luke's record is flawed, then who has the burden of proof here? These are simple questions, but they cut to the chase. And we need to ask those simple questions. Help people to see the truth of this. One more thing before we go on and really start talking about Jesus. If Luke is basing this on eyewitness testimony, then there's an intricate fabric of testimony that he weaves into the storyline, if you will. And I believe in the first 2 chapters we have clear evidence of who the first witness is. You have in chapter 1, verse 29, Mary was greatly troubled at the angel's statement. You have in chapter 141, Mary arose and went with haste to visit her relative Elizabeth. You have in chapter 1, verse 56, Mary stayed with her for about 3 months, presumably long enough for John the Baptist to have been born. In chapter 2, verse 7, Mary wrapped the baby Jesus in cloths and laid him in a manger. In chapter 2, verse 19, Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. In chapter 2, 34 and 35, Simon blesses Jesus in the temple and warns Mary, a sword will pierce even your own soul. In chapter 2, verse 41, we learn that Jesus' parents used to go to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover. An incidental detail, but nonetheless something his parents used to do. His parents were unaware of his staying behind the city at age 12, chapter 2, verse 43. When they finally found him, his mother said to him, "Isn't this like a mother who's in despair? Son, why have you treated us this way?" Chapter 2, verse 48. And after returning to Nazareth, his mother treasured all these things in her heart, chapter 2, verse 51. And we learn from Acts 1:14 that Mary was still alive, at least at the very beginning of things. And I believe she would have been called upon to leave a record of her remembrances of these vital events at the very beginning of things. Whether Luke is consulting a written record after Mary's death or he had talked to Mary personally, I believe Mary is your eyewitness. She knew everything, either firsthand or secondhand, everything that happens in chapters 1 and 2. And we've got her gut reactions, even. So we're dealing with eyewitness testimony, which is major. When Peter writes about the evidence for Christianity in 2 Peter chapter 1, there are 2 things that he specifically focuses on. One is eyewitness testimony, and the other is fulfilled prophecy. First of all, he zeroes in on being eyewitnesses of his majesty, chapter 1, verse 15, and he cites the transfiguration scene. He's basically saying, we were there. We heard the voice out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. I was there, is what Peter is saying. And then he cites fulfilled prophecy, that we can now see in retrospect all the brilliance of Old Testament prophecies hundreds of years in advance that were fulfilled to a T in the life of Jesus. So we've got a foundation of evidence, and we'll talk more about that on, I guess, Saturday morning, when we talk about conviction of mind as a component of our faith and the faith that we need to build in order to come to terms with Jesus. But I want to go beyond that for now and look a little bit about at Jesus himself. When you begin to open up the hood and look inside and you begin to probe the depths of what we actually see, when you look at what Jesus said and when you look at what he did, and again, I'm dumbfounded at what Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism don't have that we have. Jesus does incredible things. He says incredible things. But they're entirely believable when you put the whole package together. And if you want an honest look, it's just like those who wanted to just see Jesus in John the 12th chapter. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. You want to see the real Jesus? The Jesus who really lived, the Jesus of history? The Jesus that really existed, what he really said, what he really stood for, what he really did? When you look at the real Jesus, he defies expectations in terms of being so unique that there was no one that's ever been quite like him. No one ever thought like he thought. He instinctively thought at a superior level. In an atmosphere of prejudice and hatred, he taught that a Samaritan could be noble and a sinner could actually be loved. In an atmosphere or his sense of justice would not permit him to ignore the merchandising of the temple, so he takes a cord of whips and whips out the money changers, drives them out of the temple. His closest disciples constantly misunderstood him. They looked like clods time after time after time. When he spoke of the leaven of the Pharisees, they were looking about where the bread is. When they argued amongst themselves who was the greatest in the kingdom, he brings a little child. Says, that's what the kingdom's like. You need to be like that. When the issue is the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of riches, and Jesus turns away a rich young ruler, and the disciples' response is basically, if there's no money in this, what's in it for us? And Jesus teaches them a valuable lesson about eternal things versus things of this world. It's easier to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven, he says. No one ever thought quite like he thought. He's constantly thinking on a superior level to those all around him. He was constantly misunderstood because of that. No one ever claimed what he claimed. At least no one of sound mind and honorable word. There have been a lot of crazy people over the years that have made ridiculous claims, but those claims are easily dismissed. But when Jesus makes a claim, it's not so easily dismissed because of the character of the person making the claim. He claimed to be the Christ, the Son of God. He says in John 14, verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. He claimed to have power on earth to forgive sins. He claimed to be the light of the world, the good shepherd, the resurrection and the life. He claimed to be the great I am, which is putting himself on par with Almighty God. No one who had the intellectual prowess and the soundness of mind, the compassion for others, and the breadth of influence that Jesus had has ever made such ridiculous claims. They're either absolutely absurd or they're absolutely true. And we need to decide after looking at the whole picture here. No one ever taught exactly like he taught. After he finished the most famous sermon that he preached, Sermon on the Mount, this is how that sermon ends in Matthew 7, 28, 29. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. For he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. When the Jewish religious leaders sent the temple police to arrest Jesus on one occasion, they came back empty-handed. Why didn't you arrest him, was the question. And the police officer said, never did a man speak the way this man speaks. John 7:46. Malcolm Muggeridge says he gave us these wonderfully illuminating contradictions of his. The first to be last. The poorest, the richest. The weakest, the strongest. The most obscure, the most celebrated. He silenced the stridency of the ego, freed the elbows and unharnessed the shoulders from their urge to push and shove, abated the will's rage and the flesh's obduracy. The meek, he told us, would inherit the earth. And he showed us how to be meek, humility being the very condition of virtue. He was simply put the greatest teacher who ever lived. Pick up one of the Gospels and read what he taught. It's spellbinding. No one ever lived like he lived. He actually practiced what he preached. He's constantly talking about all these lofty ideals, and he's living them perfectly. I don't know anyone who's ever done that. I'm humbled when I've had an opportunity to influence a lot of people in life occupying this role. And people automatically assume that I do a better job living what I preach than I really do. And I'm humbled and I'm ashamed because I don't always live what I preach. I try, and I have fallen short time and time again. But I look at Jesus, I want to be like him. He perfectly lived what he preached. He always insisted on what was honorable and right. In John the 18th chapter, 22 and 23, during his mock trial, when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" He challenged others to convict him of sin, knowing that they could not do it, even when they tried to entrap him time after time. One of his closest associates, the Apostle Peter, writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, 22 and 23, "He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges righteously." No one ever lived the life that he lived. And in so living that life, he qualified himself not only to live for us, but to die for us. No one ever did quite what he did. When he claimed to have power on earth to forgive sins, there was a lot of rumbling about that. And he proved what could not be seen with what could be verified. He told the man on whom he had pronounced that benefit of forgiveness of sins to rise, take up his pallet, and to walk home, even though he was a paralytic. He was paralyzed. And suddenly that man had strength of legs to get up and actually take his pallet out the door. In Luke chapter 7, when messengers from John the Baptist came and questioned Jesus as to whether he was really the Messiah, he performed some miracles and he answered them. "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up. The poor have good news preached to them, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews, comes to him by night and says, "Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher sent from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." John 3, verse 2. He healed the sick. He fed the hungry. He cast out demons. He walked on water. He raised the dead. He predicted his own death and the precise time of his resurrection. And when the time came, it all came to pass just as he said it would. No one's ever done that except for Jesus. No one ever had the impact on the hearts of people quite like Jesus has had. Consider the impact he's had on the human race. H.G. Wells, who was an unbeliever, said, "When I was asked which single individual had left the most permanent impression on the world, the manner of the questioner almost carried the implication that it was Jesus of Nazareth. I agreed." When Socrates died, his words were forgotten except by a few students. Jesus predicted, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Matthew 24:35. C.S. Lewis said, I have been reading poems, romances, vision, literature, legends, myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know that no one of them is like this. J.B. Phillips, the translator, said this has the ring of truth. And it does. Lord Byron said, if ever man was God or God man, Jesus Christ was both. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs which you do unless God is with him, Nicodemus. Or Thomas, doubting Thomas, would say, my Lord and my God. When he saw the marks of a resurrected Lord. And Saul of Tarsus, whom we better know as the Apostle Paul, and what a change occurred in him. It's totally inexplicable if it were not for Jesus and his resurrection. He would ultimately say, public enemy number one, by the way, who converts. And not only does he convert, he becomes the chief apologist, as it were, of Christianity. More than that, I count all things to be lost in view of the surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and count them but rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ. Philippians 3:8. Or Peter, the Apostle Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, Matthew 16:16. Or John 6:68 and 69. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Who has ever had that kind of impact? No one ever demanded what Jesus demands. Nothing less than absolute loyalty to his person, the highest principles the world has ever known. To take up our cross, to deny ourselves, take up our cross and follow him. He says in Mark 8:38, whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes again in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. If someone objects that fanatics of every stripe demand nothing less, we must say in response to the object of their commitment is inferior, which leads to inferior motives, which leads to inferior standards of behavior. It's inevitable. Jesus challenges us to go exactly where the truth leads us, with the most honorable motives ever set before human beings. It's because truth is built into the system, absolute truth. Only Jesus has given us a perfect faith to uphold, a perfect cause to join, a perfect plan to follow. Only Jesus has told us, if you love me, you will keep my commandments, John 14:15. Only Jesus has challenged us to love others as he has first loved us, not to exploit others, but to love them as ourselves. The motive behind everything that he teaches is love. That's not the lunacy of a crazy person. When you compare his thoughts, his claims, his teachings, his life, his deeds, his impact, and his demands with anybody else in all of history, he stands alone. He stands alone. And there's power in that. And so when I open up Luke, and we come across these simple words, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, I read these words with a great degree of confidence. And I read them carefully because eternity hangs in the balance when I read them. Someone has written, he was born in an obscure village, the son of humble people. He grew up in that small town and worked with his father in the carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He was only 33 when the opinion of the tyrants and ill-wishers turned against him. Some of his friends deserted him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and he is the worship figure of the human race and the leader of mankind's progress. All the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliaments that have ever met, all the kings and the rulers that have ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on this earth as much as that one solitary life. Which is why Simon Greenleaf, one of the greatest legal minds this country has ever produced, who put to the test Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John from a legal point of view and the testimony of the witnesses involved, would come to this conclusion. Either the men of Galilee were men of superlative wisdom and extensive knowledge and experience and of deeper skill in the arts of deception than any and all others before or after them, or they have truly stated the astonishing things which they saw and heard. And I leave you with that. In the next few lessons, we're going to go to the next step. And what do we do with this Jesus? How do we respond to him? What in terms of what he claims, what does it really mean for our lives? And so we're going to be looking at that in the next few lessons. This particular lesson is not absolutely essential for every last person to the nth degree, because a lot of people already have some degree of faith in Jesus, but it's not a bad exercise to go through for all of us, because there are a whole lot of people who need to go through this step as they build their faith and are able to come to terms with Jesus and with what Luke says about Jesus, with what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all say about Jesus. And I would even go as far as to say that you're either in a posture of hostility and rebellion against him, or your heart is bowed down in total unconditional surrender. But we'll be talking about that in the evenings and the mornings to come. If we can help you come to terms with Jesus, if you know what you need to do, put your faith and trust in him, if you're ready to repent of your sins, if you're ready to quit your nonsense and give your life over to him, if you're ready to be baptized for the forgiveness of every sin you've ever committed, if you're ready to trust him with everything you've got, then now is the time. Now is the day of salvation. We can help you with that. Won't you come? As together we stand and sing.
Number 146.